My name is Samir Haddad and I teach at Fordham University, and this presentation is titled Teaching with Untranslatables in the Beast and the Sovereign Volume 1. So just by way of introduction, I'd like to provide a bit of background to this paper. It's part of a broader project that I'm investigating or pursuing on multilingualism in teaching and learning in philosophy. So the context of my teaching is in the United States in a philosophy department, and certainly in my own experience, and I'd say this is probably the experience of many of my colleagues across the US, philosophy is primarily monolingual. I think the vast majority of teaching takes place in English, with texts in English. Students speak in English in the class and are expected to write essays in the class. And that takes place despite the fact that many philosophical texts are originally written in other languages and translated into English. And also despite the fact that many of our students speak other languages as well. So in my own case, I specialize in French philosophy, but even when I'm teaching an introductory class, because my university has a strong historical emphasis in philosophy, in teaching philosophy, usually my current iteration of my introduction to philosophy class has 15 texts and 13 are written in a language other than English originally. And I also ask my students how many languages they speak and which ones. And regularly in a class of first years, there's something like 20 people in the room, and there's usually around a dozen different languages that people have knowledge of. So this project is really looking to see how one can take advantage of this resource, both the resources in written philosophy and the resources that students possess, these linguistic resources. And as a way into it, I want to focus on using untranslatables in teaching. Now, by focusing on untranslatables, my work is in many ways inspired by the work of Barbara Cassin and her Vocabulaire Européen de Philosophie, which is translated into multiple languages now, the Dictionary of Untranslatables. It appears in English. But I guess one difference, or I'm taking my inspiration from Cassin, but I'd note that I see Cassin's work with the Vocabulaire is very much a work focused on what is the generativity or the fecundity of untranslatables for philosophical research. And I want to ask the same kinds of question, what is the generativity or fecundity of untranslatables, but in teaching and learning, philosophical teaching and learning. So that's taking my lead from Cassin, but pushing it in her project in a different direction. And I have actually published a little bit on this, so I've put a reference up here to a paper that recently appeared where I investigate Derrida's teaching with untranslatables in his hospitality seminars, the published sessions of that. So in many ways, this presentation is a companion piece to that essay. Finally, I'll just note, as you've already noticed, I'm speaking in English, and I will continue to speak in English throughout this presentation. I'll put up citations both in English and French. I'll read out the English, and I'll probably move relatively quickly through the French. I won't be reading them aloud for the sake of time. But if you do wish to spend some time looking at the French citations, or even some of the English ones that I'll be moving through pretty quickly, just pause the video. I'd encourage you to do that in order to actually read them yourself. Okay, so let's get underway. Well, why The Beast and the Sovereign Volume 1? Derrida talks about translation and untranslatables really across his seminars, even from the very beginning in the early 1960s. The first seminar we have that's been published from 1964-65 on Heidegger was delivered at a time when most of Heidegger's work and most of Being in Time was not translated into French. So much of that seminar is caught up with questions of translation. So this is something that Derrida has always paid attention to in his teaching. But the phenomena I'm interested in is a little more specific, because it's not just a matter of Derrida translating texts for his students or talking about ways to translate or highlighting untranslatable terms, but I'm interested in moments where he does that it really serves a pedagogical purpose. So it's a little more specific than just a general attention to translation and untranslatability. But this volume, The Beast and the Sovereign Volume 1, well, one reason to pick it out is that Derrida, at the end of this volume, in the final session, which is just some improvised remarks that he makes to his students, kind of wrapping the whole seminar up, he says the following. He says, "I've chosen, in attempting this quasi-concluding reflection as a kind of premise for the discussion that will follow, to mark, remark, and have you remark with me the fact that at bottom everything we have spoken about came down to problems of translation. Translation in a sense at once fundamental and diverse." So Derrida himself, when he's improvising a way of summing up the whole seminar, he chooses translation as the focal point. In what sense is translation fundamental across this seminar? Well, Derrida goes on to give three ways. The first way is that he points out that the distinction between reaction and response, which is used to distinguish the animal from the human, is tied to translation. So I'm not going to read out this citation, but this distinction is something that appears across the seminar and is examined across the seminar. And here Derrida is highlighting or thinking about the way we relate to this distinction in terms of translation. There's the French citation for that. So that's the first way translation is fundamental in the way Derrida presents it as such. The second way Derrida notes that one of the guiding words of the seminar, bête, it's la bête et le souverain, so this key word, and together with a related word, bêtise, these words are untranslatable. And here there's another citation here on the slide pointing this out. Again, I won't read out this citation for lack of time, but Derrida's point here, interestingly, he says, Bête and Bétise are untranslatable not only from French into other languages, but he makes the claim here, and this is a claim I'll investigate further in this presentation, that it's untranslatable from French into French. Okay, so Derrida here is now using the term untranslatable in a slightly unusual way, but that's something we'll investigate further. Third, there's the citation in French. Third, another reason that translation is fundamental is that Derrida points out that the Greek words bios, zoe, and above all logos are decisive in the Western tradition, both in this tradition's treatment of the seminar's theme and beyond. So here he makes this claim that the whole history of the Western world is in play in these operations of translation of the word logos. Now, this is a very bold claim by Derrida, and to be honest, I mean, he's making it in the 13th session, the final session. He'd been investigating bios and zoe and logos in the previous session, session 12. I don't think he really gives us an extensive account, even in session 12, of why this is so fundamental to the Western tradition, but he does discuss it there. Anyway, so these three reasons are the ones that Derrida gives for why translation is fundamental. I'm going to ignore the third for the sake of time. One, because it's vast, to show that logos is the translations of logos as being fundamental in the Western tradition or decisive in that tradition. But two, because I don't think, as I've just mentioned, Derrida doesn't really investigate this at great length in the seminar. However, the first 2 points I am going to be paying attention to. And in particular, I'm going to be looking at the way the second point, the fact that the bête and bêtise are untranslatable, leads Derrida to demonstrate to his students that this distinction outlined in the first point is actually an unstable distinction, or one that can't be sustained. So I'm going to be focusing mainly on point 2 here in order to challenge point 1, or challenge the distinction mentioned in point 1. And as I say, I'm leaving aside point 3 altogether. Okay. Now, Derrida does this in the seminar, this investigation of Bête and Bétise, across 2 seminar sessions, session 5 and then session 6. So it's 2 weeks of the seminar, and these took place in late January and early February of 2001. Okay, so moving ahead then to session 5, I'm sorry, not of 2001, of 2002. That's why I thought that doesn't sound quite right. So moving ahead to session 5. Now, just to say, I mean, in almost all of Derrida's seminars, there's always a lot going on in any particular session. And I'm going to be picking out just one through line in these sessions 5 and 6 to do with Bête and Bétise. But Derrida says a lot more than just focusing on these words. And I'm going to be looking in session 5 at Derrida's reading of Deleuze, but Derrida investigates a lot of other thinkers too. Just as always in Derrida's seminars, there's a lot of experimentation going on. Derrida sort of tries out certain ideas. You get some thoughts begun and never quite completed, even though these seminars were written out. So when one wants to talk about it in 20 minutes, one's forced to really pick and choose. Okay, so Derrida on Deleuze on Bête and Bétise. And now let me just say a tiny bit about Bête and Bétise before I talk about what Derrida says about Deleuze. If Derrida is right that these terms are untranslatable, not only into a language such as English, but also within French, I can't exactly give you a definition of these terms, but I can say a little bit about them. Bête is a noun, la bête, which is probably most easily translated as the beast. So it's a noun that applies to animals. primarily. But it can also be an adjective. You can call someone Bête, or an action Bête, or something that you've said Bête, or even a situation in some cases Bête. But it's an adjective that primarily adheres to the human. Okay, so this is one interesting thing about Bête, is that as a noun it applies to animals. As an adjective it primarily applies to humans. Bêtise is a noun, and it can be translated in several different ways. But it can be taken to mean sort of just a general lack of intelligence. But also more specifically, it can be something you utter. You can say a bêtise, sort of some stupidity, we would say in English possibly. An action could be, an act could be a bêtise. It can also be translated in a slightly different direction as a trifle, or something that's just of no consequence. So something that's almost irrelevant. It's a bêtise. Okay. So I've given you a little bit about these terms, but Derrida's claim is they're untranslatable, so I'm not going to be able to exhaust their meaning. All right, so what Derrida does is he reads Deleuze using and engaging these terms. There are two parts to Derrida's reading. One, he focuses on Deleuze and Guattari's Mille Plateaux and the appearance of Bêtise in a discussion of psychoanalysis there. I'm not going to talk about that. It's less useful for my purposes. The second is more useful, is where Derrida examines some remarks Deleuze makes across a couple of pages of difference and repetition. And Derrida reads some remarks of Deleuze and ends up with the following conclusions. So these are the results, I'm going to say, of Derrida's readings of difference and repetition. Derrida claims that Deleuze firmly aligns Bête and Bêtise with the human, and we have this quote here from Deleuze. Bêtise is not animality. The animal is guaranteed by specific forms that prevent it from being Bête. Okay, so here Derrida sees Deleuze as firmly putting Bêtise and Bête on the side, Bête as an adjective, on the side of the human, or divorcing it from the animal. Deleuze also distinguishes Bêtise from error. So this means for Derrida that Deleuze is moving it out of the realm of knowledge. And then Derrida argues that what he does, though, is associates it with judgment. And then Derrida argues that this move to judgment means that Deleuze aligns Bêtise with human freedom. And it's in this way, according to Derrida, that we get this division between the human and the animal that's appealing to Bête and Bêtise being secured. By aligning Bêtise with freedom, with human freedom, then Bêtise is on the side of the human. Okay, so that's Derrida's reading of Deleuze. I'm not going to go into whether it's an accurate reading or not, but this is the reading he presents. And this takes place in session 5. And in session 5, we also get some hints. Derrida will have some comments where he flags and looks ahead to the argument he's going to make against Deleuze, but we're really going to see this in session 6. So let's turn to session 6. And session 6 begins in the following way. Derrida poses this to his students at the beginning of the session. He says, I would defy anyone to swear, i.e. to declare under oath, engaging that person's responsibility, and thus to attest solemnly that he or she knows what he or she means to say or means to do when they say, in French, bête, throwing out the adjective bête, or even better, or even then the noun bêtise, the being bête of bêtise, or else, we didn't talk about this last week, the adverb bêtement. Try, just to get an idea, try to specify and separate out what you mean by these words. So I've avoided the comments in parentheses just for the sake of time. So Derrida puts this challenge to his students, and his claim is going to be that you can't do this in good faith. You can't actually have knowledge of your meaning of these words. That's what Derrida is going to aim to show. And he's actually and then he suggests immediately after posing this that if he's right, that you can't do this, then the adjective bête becomes an invective. It becomes an insult launched at someone, and he uses the term as an act of war. So here he's invoking a distinction by Kant between war and conflict, but to call it an act of war means he's moving it out of rationality. So the consequence of all of this, we haven't done the demonstration yet, is that it would be moving it not only with Deleuze out of the realm of knowledge, but even beyond judgment as well, or outside of judgment. Okay. So then Derrida sort of starts to fill in. Well, he says, well, if you were to try to do this, to work out the meaning of bête, he says, well, and he sort of he's working through what his students might be thinking out loud. Derrida is working through out loud. He starts to distinguish bête from various other terms in French that are close to it, but not quite the same. And as he says here, it is never quite the same thing. And I've listed some of the French words there. But the difference can be felt and marked only in the concrete, situated, contextualized implementation in the idiom of each situation at each individual, of each group of individuals, each social scene. So Derrida's claim is that bête and bêtise are really only used in these highly contextualized situations, each time different in French. Then he turns to other languages, and he lists various German and English words, which I put on the slide, that inadequately translate bête and bêtise. But he goes on to say that the point of untranslatability, and the French here, point d'intraduisibilité, intraduisibilité is a horrible word for me to try to pronounce. Jeff Bennington, the English translator of this text, notes that can be translated as point of untranslatability or no untranslatability at all, and we'll see that coming up a bit later. But, just to say that Derrida says the point here, to say that it's inadequately translated into these English and German words, is not to say that it's not untranslatable because those words lack the connotation of the beast. Because Derrida points out there are other languages that do have these kinds of connotations with words related to stupidity or bête. So the question is, well, what is the point of untranslatability here? Why is he claiming these terms are untranslatable? And in order to demonstrate it, he turns to the work of Avital Ronell, in particular Avital Ronell's Stupidity, her book Stupidity, which had been published just a couple of months earlier at the end of 2001. Okay, so what Derrida then does is he reads several pages from Ronell, and he just reads aloud a lot of Ronell's work, a lot of her claims. There's some commentary, but it's more or less Derrida just bringing Ronell's voice into the room. And what Ronell does in the pages that Derrida cites is that she's exploring the untranslatability of stupidity, but also of a whole host of similar words or related words in German, in ancient Greek, and in French, and demonstrating their untranslatability. So that's what Derrida is interested in showing, and he uses Ronell to show it. Then, after doing this presentation of her work, he sums up as follows. Now, I've got a fairly long citation here. I'm not going to read it all out. He's pointing out that what Ronell shows by moving between languages in these ways is that really all we can do is just keep retranslating stupidity and these terms into our own idiom. We're never going to arrive at the proper meaning. So I put in bold at the end here the part of this citation that I'm interested in. Derrida says, in this retranslation of stupidity by Bétise, or vice versa, between Dummheit, Bétise, and stupidity, there is a remainder that is untranslated and untranslatable, and that this remainder cannot be reduced to the reference made by the French alone, or some other language, but rarely to the beast. What remains absolutely untranslatable, one can say so a priori. What remains untranslatable in the very economy of the word, in the word for word or the one word for one word, is the totality of the idiomatic network that coordinates all these values, all these connotations, all these quasi-synonymies, or even homonymies. Okay, and there's the citation in French. So, what's the upshot of this? The question was, well, what is untranslatable? It's not the fact that bête carries this connotation of animality. It's that what we get with bête, with all of these words related to bête and stupidity and Dummheit and so on, what we get is a whole network that is embedded in the idiom that resists translation, that can't be transferred from one language to another. Okay. So what this means as some consequences is that not that translation is impossible, but there's no simple translatability or simple untranslatability. And that's this idea of no translatability at all, untranslatability at all, or the point of untranslatability, sort of moving between these two poles. Another way to put a similar point is that there's no idealized meaning that either exists between languages or within each language. Okay, and I've got another citation there making that claim. And then the final way Derrida moves this point is into Husserlian language, where he says, Bétise has no free ideality. And what this means in terms of Husserlian language is that it doesn't obtain the status of being a universally intelligible object independent of its instantiation across subjective acts that intend it. All right, I'm almost there. Just to say then, the further consequence of this, and particularly this last move into Husserlian language, is that Derrida then used this denial of Husserlian freedom to call into question Deleuze's move of aligning Bêtise with human freedom. And if we can call that into question, then Derrida's suggestion is we can call into question the way that Deleuze has aligned Bêtise with the human and against the animal. So we're calling into question the human-animal distinction that Deleuze is making. And more broadly, and I won't read out this citation, Derrida thinks that this untranslatability of Bête and Bétise shows that the distinction between reaction and response cannot be sustained. This is this distinction Derrida has tracked from Descartes onwards in a number of different thinkers. The difference between an animal and a human is that animals only react, whereas humans can respond. Derrida argues that this untranslatability of Bétise undermines that. All right. So, and there's the citation in French. I have to bring things to a close because of time. So just by way of conclusion, I really want to make just a couple of points. I want us to just take a step back and think of what's happened here. What has Derrida done? I've argued very schematically that he turns to untranslatables, and in fact he turns to Avital Ronell's discussion of untranslatables, in order to make a certain demonstration about a distinction that Deleuze draws, but also more broadly a distinction drawn between the human and the animal. Now, it's not that Derrida had to do this. He had to turn to untranslatables, because there are other ways of challenging these distinctions. Okay. But I do think it's significant that Derrida does it, and in the way he does it. And in particular, what I think is significant is in the way that he turns to Avital Ronell's English and her English text in order to do this. And then in her English text, her turning to more than one language in addition to Greek and French. So just what I want to say by way of conclusion, and there's a lot more to say here, and perhaps we can talk about this in the discussion, is that I think this is something we get from teaching with untranslatables. And I'll just talk about myself now. I'll step out from Derrida. When I try to teach with untranslatables, what I find happening is that I actually deprive myself of what I might term a certain pedagogical sovereignty. Or to put it in more positive terms, I share pedagogical agency with the students, in fact, with my students. Why? Because when we talk about untranslatables, we're immediately led into discussing, well, how might one translate this term that's in question into other languages? And it's at that moment that I can appeal to my students with their 12 or so languages and get them to take over pedagogically, get them to step up and start teaching. There's a lot more to say here, but I've run out of time, so I'll just close it there. And just with this thought that teaching with untranslatables can give us more than one language and more than one teacher. Thanks very much.